Hello all, and welcome to another episode of Ask Andy Everything. My name's Andy Law, I make games and I play games, and I'm very happy to be here to answer your questions about anything you fancy throwing my way. Not only do I make games for a living and do all that fun stuff, I also play them online for a living. Kinda. We don't exactly do it for the money, we do it for fun. But yes, I do the LAWhammer streams as well, where I play fantasy roleplay every single week, and you can watch me GM games like mad. And our most recent escapades were something special last Friday, but I won't be dialing into that. So how does this work? If you haven't done one of these before, I take questions live and I answer them and we see where they go. As is always the case, there might be super chats coming in. These are chats that people have paid for. If someone's going to pay for me to answer a question, I will always answer those first. So be aware, super chats take preference for, I think, very real fiscal reasons. If you didn't know, for example, I have an enormous dental bill coming my way, and I'm going to take any penny that anyone throws at me right now. So let's have a quick check-in with Magroth drops in and says, let's hope it's as crazy as the Chaos God tier stream list. For those of you that don't watch all of the Lorebeards streams that I do with Lore Master Sotek, we had one just last Wednesday. And on Wednesday, we tier listed, i.e. did a big list and ranked them of all the Chaos Gods in Warhammer. And that stream got proper crazy because, well, tons of folks dropped super chats, which was super nice to pay for my dental bills. That money has just arrived over on YouTube and Twitch, and we have made for my dental account a full 1/4 of my entire bill already paid. So thank you so much if you were involved with that. Now, as I mentioned before, if people are dropping super chats, which we've had a bunch of in already, I'll be bringing those up first. Let's dive in straight away so we can start answering some questions. Aleph Flux. Hi, Aleph. Thanks very much for the super chat. Who is Kurdan in your Kadai list, and what do they do? Is he attested outside of LAWhammer? So, for those of you who don't know, Kurdan is an elf god in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Kurdan does indeed have a reference outside of LAWhammer. It was one of the many deities for the elves that were made up by Gav Thorpe, assuming he even remembers that he did this. This one comes from his Malekith novel, one of the Age of Legends novels. I think that's what they're called, Age of Legends, Time of Legends, whatever they were called. And Kurdan is given scant detail beyond the fact that he has his equivalent of priests and that they are diviners. So this is somebody who is representing elves who can take the surrounding world around them or other implements to divine a potential future. So Kadai God, the Nagarive elves largely sneer upon it. But beyond that, we have no details in the LAWhammer version. I have a fully realized version of who Kurdan is, but that's just for LAWhammer. That's basically my version rather than what you will find in any book out there. Aleph Fox then continues, apparently. Thanks again, Aleph. How would you distinguish between Lilith's prophecy and Morai's Hegs? Then between Lilith's magic and Hoeth's. Okay, so we have different gods here. Again, for those of you who don't know the difference between the gods, these are all Warhammer elf gods. Lilith is the maiden goddess often ascribed to magic and sorcery, where Morai Heg is the crone, another goddess often ascribed to magic in a variety of ways, but more keenly associated with fate. So the difference here is that Morai Heg is effectively a death goddess, and all things that die are in her province, and effectively all futures are known to her because of this. So in many respects, Morai Heg is the goddess of fate, and her magics lie there, where Lilith is much more about prophecy and potential. Lilith is not about certainty. So I think that's a very quick and easy way to view it. The certainty of age and the crone with Morai Heg, and the uncertainty of youth and potential that comes with Lilith. Then flipping over to the difference between Lilith magic and Hoeth's magic, it's again much more of style. Lilith is a much more creatively inspired youthful magic, where Hoeth is one all about study and understanding. Hoeth is the god of wisdom, and he is very much a god that is focused upon study and understanding. So that's loosely the difference. For the LAWhammer version, they've got very clear differences how each of the winds of magic are used by each of them and how they combine into different forms of high magic. Hopefully that gives you a loose guideline. Magroth, loved the super fun Chaos stream. It was a good stream. And if you didn't watch it, it's worth going over and checking. You can find that on our YouTube account. In fact, it's on the LAWhammer YouTube account for that one. If you go check over, you'll find the video on demand for that one. On another note, what is your opinion on the 2011 Nekron Rewrite? Oh, that's a left field question. Curious about your thoughts. So for those of you that don't know, the Necrons are from the Warhammer 40,000 setting. They were originally introduced, back in the mid-90s. I can't remember the exact date, 95 off the top of my head. And come 2011, their lore and the 5th edition of Warhammer 40k received a significant rewrite. To keep it nice and simple and not go into any of the depths, beforehand, the Necrons were a slave race to these great creatures called Khitan, and the Khitan largely controlled them. On the flip side, as we move over to, and I did say that, for those of you who watch LAWhammer, you'll know that that is a cringeworthy statement, but on the flip side over in 2011, instead, the Khitan are... How are we going to sum this up really simply? The Necrons have freed themselves from the Khitan. Let's just simply say that. The Khitan are shattered into thousands of shards across the galaxy. And the Necrons have much more character because of that. Now, loosely speaking, what are my thoughts? My first thought is that this is something that happens in Warhammer a lot, and it happens specifically for factions that aren't necessarily as popular. By what I mean here is the Games Workshop, whenever they're working on a new faction, and whoever is involved with doing it, often ask a question of, what can we do to make this particular group, faction, belief system, whatever it may be, more interesting and more likely to sell more miniatures? And what can we do to also support our licensors, Black Library, to ensure that we can build super cool novels? And the Necrons, as they stood before, were almost characterless. And then afterwards, each of the individual Necrons could hold much more characters. So you can immediately see why they would want to do that, at least from the more creative standpoint. My general opinion about this one is I actually quite liked it. I incorporated much of the 2011 lore into one of, this is going to sound stupid, but into one of my Warhammer campaigns. I know it's 40k lore, but sometimes 40k and Warhammer have weird crossovers, and in my own campaigns, I have done this. So I incorporated all the new lore. I think it worked really quite well. I don't think it's one of those ones that are a bit weird. Games Workshop do this to the minor factions or the lesser factions a lot. The big ones that everyone knows and sell really well, they tend to modify in far smaller ways. But if you're involved with anything Games Workshop, be aware the faction that you love today will probably be written. Some people, for example, those who like Chaos Dwarves or Beastmen, have seen this happen to them multiple times. Others, perhaps those who like, say, Ultramarines or Core Empire, rarely see heavy rewrites. But if we take a look at the 8th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, it made quite a lot of significant step forwards for almost every single faction. Rewriting pantheons, updating pantheons, rewriting the core natures of how the armies manifested, or just adding new troop types that had never existed before. So loosely speaking, this is something that happens all the time. So my opinion isn't the negative that many come at this with, because I've been through Games Workshop rewrites through edition to edition to edition so many times that my youthful exuberance for the setting I was exposed to and thinking that's the one true setting has been completely replaced with that's just not how the setting works. So I'm not sure that really answers your question much, but hopefully it did a bit. It's moved down to Magroth again. Oh, thanks again, Magroth. Apparently there's a reference to the Khitan. Oh, this is all linking together quite well. In the Liber Chaotica, yes, there is. And that they fought the elven gods as well. If so, does this relate to Fantasy's War in Heaven? And how would you use one in Warhammer Fantasy? Right, so this is running from memory here, but the Liber Chaotica, written by Marianne von Stauffer, references the Aingir. The Aingir are effectively a Warhammer Fantasy reinterpretation of the Khitan. You'll find that loosely the visions that Richter Kless receives in those books, he's a priest of Sigmar in those books who's receiving visions of chaos. The visions he receives of those do indeed sort of come from 40k, and he's receiving visions of what happened in the 40k universe and then reinterpreting it through the lens of his own individual beliefs. And loosely, it all sort of makes a simple sense. He repitches the idea of the Khitan and dials it back a little bit, ties it to the elven gods, doesn't call them the Khitan, instead calls them the Aingir. And the Aingir are at war in much the way that you describe. And the larger question, does it relate to the Fantasy's War in Heaven? Absolutely. If you're doing yourself your own version of the Aingir and the War of Heaven and why it came into place, you could easily draw from either the old or the new Nekron lore. And by old, I mean pre-2011 or after 2011, both of which work well. There's a particularly gorgeous new miniature for the Deathbringer just released very recently. So, yeah, how could I use that? You could just use it in spinning new myths that use the Ingir, perhaps even drawing on the Emir from, say, Norse legend or something, to wrap it all together inside a bubble that everyone can immediately access without too much difficulty. And then repitch that possibly even with the Sky Titans that sit over in the Mountains of Morn, and using that perhaps as some sort of new bow to wrap it all up with. But effectively, you can use it to develop the myths and take the myths in new directions. This is something that I like doing for my games, adding new myths and telling new stories with existing settings. If you've watched my LAWhammer streams over that deal with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay largely, but if you watch the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay streams, you'll find that I significantly changed the background while simultaneously not necessarily contradicting it by taking several established norms inside the Warhammer world and saying, this is what they say, but what if it had a different origin point? And here's a different way you could interpret it. So yeah, I'd be looking to use that for extra myth material. Moving down to Simon Parkinson. Thank you very much, Simon. Critical question. I do like the critical ones. As you're out grilling in the Polish sun, sausage, satay chicken, trout, or chili halloumi, all invited. Well, I'm glad you invited us all. Everybody pile over to Simon's house for a lovely barbecue. As to what I prefer there, much like most European countries, Scotland, the UK as a whole, has tons of different sausage. So it depends on what sort of sausage you're serving. Satay chicken is always brilliant. Trout, I kind of love. And chili halloumi, I just love halloumi. Oh, a nice grilled halloumi. If I was given all of those, I would probably partake of everything. Maybe out of those, the halloumi first, because I really love halloumi. Oh, yummy. Okay, Cole Patterson. What's a saint in the faiths that use the term in Warhammer Fantasy? This question is more controversial than you might first think. Saints, the idea of some sort of special servant of the gods, have been around in Warhammer for a long time, since the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. However, there came a period during the late 90s and into the noughties where a host of folks at Games Workshop, who were responsible for deciding what Warhammer was and what Warhammer 40k was, decided that Saints sounded too 40k for their preference, because it had been so heavily used by a lot of recent 40k developments, and they didn't want to mix up their Warhammer and their 40k lores. So when we came around to writing the Tome of Salvation for the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay in the mid-noughties, the concept of Saints came up because Saints was an established part of the background, and we were told in no uncertain terms we could not call anything a saint. Nothing. So that's why you'll find in the Tome of Salvation that the concept of the venerated soul is added. Wherever you see the word venerated soul inside the Tome of Salvation, replace it with saint. That's exactly what we were discussing. And I would recommend just pile over to the Tome of Salvation. It gives you a quick breakdown of the concept of a saint, and it gives you a quick idea of what a saint is for each of the gods. And the answer is it differs by god and by cult. For some cults, it's just basically important servants who did important things in the past for that cult. Each cult is obviously very different. Martial cults venerate different types of souls to, say, pacifist cults. So it's people who have done something really important during their mortal life. It's not simply those who are blessed by the god, because for those of you who play Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, you'll be aware there is a concept of someone who's a blessed priest. That's someone who chants a prayer, and the miracles that result from those prayers are real. It's not just simply they chant a prayer to one of the gods and things, you know, might or might not happen. Are those blessings real? Who can say? When they do stuff, their prayers, stuff happens. They bring about miracles. That's not enough to be a saint. You have to do something special. And if you do something special, you will get potentially institutions venerating you, potentially buildings named after you. But more importantly, you enter effectively the pantheon of that god. What does that mean? If you want me to use different language, I can state it really bluntly if you prefer, because you can summon up those venerated souls, those saints, using rituals that might manifest a particular saint and allow them to help in a time of great need. Bluntly, they are spirits, etheric entities, now demons, inside the pantheon of that god. What is a saint? In almost all cases, it's someone who might come back if you use the right miracle. They are people who are super important to the cult, and the people of the cult believe they're important. And that has a host of ramifications. But loosely speaking, you could easily see them as, if you wish, demon princes of each one of the gods that manifest in their own unique ways. It's a slightly controversial wording because demon prince is generally reserved for, obviously, chaos. But the concept of etheric entities for each of the gods is a core component of how the Warhammer gods work, with humans at least. So they exist, they're written about in multiple tomes and multiple references, and there are a great number of examples of great blessed priests who call upon an ancient saint or something similar and then are empowered, or that saint themselves manifests on the battlefield. There's lots of different ways that can be used in your own setting. So hopefully that gives you at least an idea. I recommend going checking Venerated Souls of the Empire over inside the Tome of Salvation if you want some more. And loosely speaking, the concept of saint is now back inside Warhammer without any issues. So the difficulties that we held back during the second edition weren't the case when I was writing, for example, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition. When I was working on that, I asked Games Workshop directly, do you wish me to avoid the term saint? Because it's always worth checking before you start writing something. And they said, yeah, no, that's not a problem at all. Away you go. That's very much a part of Warhammer through its various editions. And I was like, excellent. Phew. That means I don't need to use a slightly more contrived term like venerated soul. Because let's be blunt, I prefer to call a spade when I'm building a shed of tools. And a venerated soul is not a very clear title. It's opaque and difficult to understand. And even when we released the Tome of Salvation, some folks were confused as to what venerated soul even meant, even though it was super, super clear. Okay, moving down to Brock 6000. Hi, Andy. Hi, Brock. Are Chaos Dwarves purposely not expanding past the Darklands, or are the World's Edge Mountains and, the World's Edge and Mountains of Morn keeping them confined? So we've discussed this on Lorebeards multiple times, Sotek and I. In particular, I refer you over to our stream about Hashut, which we very recently had. I also refer you over to our stream about Zar Nagarund, where we do discuss this. Hashut in particular gets a lot of detail about this exact issue. And the conclusion that we loosely came to there was they have expanded beyond this particular area multiple times, and they've been pushed back multiple times. In fact, the old world setting looks like it's very much priming the Chaos Dwarves to take a great deal of territory up towards the north that's currently held by Kislev. And then during the Great War against Chaos that is to come in the old world setting, that Kislev territory will be largely wiped out. Presumably. They might run with a slightly different story. After all, if you go to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1st edition, the idea that Kislev goes all the way over into what they refer to as the Wheatlands in that edition, over the World's Edge Mountains, is an old concept. So they might decide to keep it. Who could say for certain? But what we can say is that the Chaos Dwarves are, in terms of their stories, they've been expanding and decreasing their borders at various times. What you have to remember, the Chaos Dwarves in particular, though, is there are very, very few of them. So expansion for them is a potentially difficult prospect because it's difficult for them to man all of those expansions or to dwarf all of those expansions. Indeed, the might of their expansion could dwarf them. I can't believe I did that. Let's just move on swiftly. Hopefully that helps a bit, Brock, but I recommend the Zar Nagarund and the Hashut streams if you would like to know more. Simon Parkinson says, why are there only 2 imperial languages, Reichspiel and Wastelander? Shouldn't every other province have its own or more? Where does classical fit? So Simon here is asking questions about the Warhammer language distributions, effectively. And in the Empire, we have ourselves 2 languages, and I'm going to call out different ones here. We have Reichspiel and we have Mutish. Over the border into the wasteland, we also have Wastelander. Why do they have their own language? And the answer here is much like real world politics. Politics in the old world have almost demanded it. In the real world, there are lots of languages that are nigh on identical, that are identified as separate languages. Equally, there's lots of languages that are just not similar at all that are said to be the same language. That's because language is largely, contrary to what you would expect, a political reality, not an actual linguistic reality. For example, Scotland has got its own language called Scots. For anyone that doesn't come from Scotland, they will say, well, isn't that just English with an accent? Now having heard it. And the answer is, well, no, but also kind of yeah. The well-known side is that Scots is as old as English. It's just English exported far further, and the Scots variety of that language just didn't export as much. It has a whole host of words that you don't find anywhere else in the UK, some of which, to me, I find bizarre are relatively rare around the world. Words like out with. That lies out with most uses of the English language for most people, where for me, it's just a standard word that I use in my spoken English. We also use different sentence structures, a classic dialectical discussion. But the language is as old, and it's referred to as a language. But if we look over at Europe, there's lots of examples of borders that have been recently established, or established after the war, or just before the war. And when those borders came up, the two new countries on either side both claimed their own language, when sometimes they both spoke pretty much an identical language. The reason for Wastelander is it's largely a political truth, and that is that they are speaking a version of Reichspiel. It's heavily accented with their own linguistic structures, but they have defined Wastelander as a separate language, not simply a dialect. For political reality, they are their own country, for want of a better description. The Wasteland is not part of the Empire. It has its own unique language as far as they're concerned. And over the last 100 years, that language has slowly but surely become something that is not mutually unintelligible to Reichspiel, but most certainly unique. That stands separate to, say, for example, Mutish. Mutish is the language of the Halflings, the Hafenspieler, or whatever you wish to call it. And the language of the Halflings was imported into the Empire when the Halflings first arrived. Interestingly, this is something that's been part of the LAWhammer streams, where we've been discussing the first arrival of the Halflings into the Empire and what happened with that over the course of the last couple of episodes. And they had their own language. It was imported in, and even 2,500 years after the founding of the Empire, their language is still spoken in various parts. The last part before we hit the classical is, wouldn't every other province have its own? Yes. Absolutely would. Every one of the provinces had its own original tribal language. And when Sigmar founded the Empire, he exported the Umberrigan version to be the language of the Reich, to be the language of all of the Empire. And he basically told everyone from now on, to make sure that we can all mutually understand each other, we're all going to be using my language for everything. And it became the language of the courts. It became the language of the heart of empire. And slowly but surely, over 2,500 years, it became the language of the entire empire. But nevertheless, they are going to be not just small pockets, not just a few dialectical differences. There are going to be multiple different languages held within the empire, many of which are as ancient, if not more ancient, than the original Umberrigan language that was the source for Reichspiel. Classical, by comparison, was imported from the south. When the first written languages were brought into the empire, they were brought in by various gods and cults from Tilia and the southern parts of the old world. The cults of Verena, for example, imported into Nuln the concept of the written word and the concept of classical, which is the language that they were using to write, which was based upon the old Tylos languages and the languages used in what is now the Border Princes. They'd all been mixed together. To a degree, classical is not Latin simply. It's a sort of mixture of Latin and Greek in terms of its real world occurrence and how it's then used inside the gaming world. So a mixture of both what Latin and Greek might offer smudged together and turn into something called classical. It's an imported language, and it is the foundation point for almost all religious texts in the empire because it's the first written language. As Reichspiel was then codified using the same lettering and later a different numbering system to effectively make Umberrigan into modern, well, not modern, ancient Reichspiel in truth, but when it was first codified, it was using classical as its foundation point and basis. Hopefully that breaks it all down loosely for you. Brock 6000, what are some interesting headcanons you have about more mundane parts of bad faction societies, like Orc economy run on teeth, but BM, CD, LM? That's a really broad question, Brock, and I come from this from a slightly unique angle. Headcanon is something that almost everybody uses to a degree when they're presenting their own versions of Warhammer. They're doing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is a game about trying to present the Warhammer world as you think it is to other people if you're a GM. But I take a slightly different view in this because I'm not just the GM who is making a story one day and presenting one version of the Warhammer world. I'm also someone who has not just created parts of the Warhammer world, but I've been responsible for other people creating it because I used to run the game where that was happening. And that means that headcanon to me is often just what I think it should be as we're working towards building up a new faction inside Warhammer or a new detail to a new village or town. And everything, as far as I'm concerned, is to be made up. I don't have this same attachment to canon that everybody else has. I once got accused of, Andy, you're just making that up. It's like, yeah, that's my job, to make up stuff for Warhammer. At that point, it's Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition, and I'd written something like 12 books by that point, written a whole bunch of cool, funky different stuff for different stuff. And then someone said, Andy, you can't do that. That's just making it up. And it's like, that's my job, is to make up stuff for Warhammer. So when it comes to this, I don't really think of them as headcanons. I just think, what would I do with them? And the detail in all of the bad factions is exceedingly low. So I would just broadly say I would do a lot. I would try to make it feel that it matches the complexity and realization that you'll find in the good side, and it all makes sense. That's what I would do. And if you want to get an idea of how that might manifest, go take a check over I always forget which stream this was for. Was it for Iron Crag? We did a big orc one in Lorebeards, and we had a huge discussion about the economy that could be run on Teeth, because they have an entire orc empire down there, which is not much discussed with, I can't remember what stream that was. If anyone's in the chat, they can tell me exactly what stream that was. That would be freaking great, because I can't remember which one. It was the Black Crag one, Hawk. Yeah, okay. Hawk says it was the Black Crag one. Great. So I'm going to believe Hawk because Hawk rocks. So yeah, go check out the Black Crag stream. I've done too many streams now, but that'll give you, I hope, a good solid idea of something that could be done to help build a different version of a bad society. But it's a little bit too broad of a question for me to just dive into in what's going to be. Oh, gosh, I'm only going to be doing this for about another 50 minutes. But if you'd like to see me do one of these things more in depth, go dive into the Lorebeards chat over in the LAWhammer Discord and just drop ideas, because you'll find that we pick up ideas from that, both Sotek and I, for next potential discussions. And one of the things that we do on Lorebeards on Wednesdays is taking something that's in the Warhammer world that's not been very well developed and giving an example of how it could be developed in a new way. So, yeah, hopefully that helps at least a little bit. Let's move down to Brock 6000. Previously, you said the White Tower of Hoth art inspired you to write. It's one of the things it did, yeah. Any other Warhammer or real life art inspired any particular stories or lore bits? So this is an interesting question, because the answer to this is an unreserved yes. Because up until I was officially writing from the game, I owned everything that Games Workshop offered, and everything that I read was a foundation point for the next set of ideas. The old adage of I stood on the shoulders of giants to lift up the next generation is, I think, an apt one here. I took what everyone else had worked on and was inspired by it to build something more. But in real life as well, there's a lot of very cool pieces, and much like, oh gosh, there's so many, I don't even know where to begin. So let's pick out a couple of Warhammer art pieces that when I was a kid really inspired me. Some of these are not going to necessarily go together. I love the idea of the serial comic art of Thrud the Barbarian. It's not Warhammer directly, but I loved it, and I redrew it multiple times. Mark Gibbons' artworks for the early 4th edition army lists were, for me, inspirational. It's one of the reasons why I work with Mark Gibbons to this day over at Rookery Publications. And indeed, because I literally can't help myself, I'm going to pull back and see, do I have a copy of Dark Deeds back there? Yes, I do. Let me just grab one. It's one of the reasons why things like Dark Deeds exist. So this is a board game that if you're watching on YouTube right now, you've got a link for sitting down in the video description. If you're watching on Twitch, there isn't a link there because it's Twitch, but I'm sure one might arrive at some point because magic. But Dark Deeds, illustrated end-to-end by Mark, is just a beautiful game. And it was Mark's art that inspired me then, and to this day continues to inspire me. There are too many pieces to list. The White Tower of Hoeth in the back of the Swordmaster of Hoeth image is one of them. In the same book, that's the High Elf Army list, you'll find the Dragon Princes of Calador art. I adored that. Truly loved it. Just chef's kiss perfect. I really like the aerial art from the Wood Elf Army list. I really like the what else do we have? I mean, there's so many nice. The first Nagash piece was brilliant. It's a shame the model was made independently of it and didn't reference it. Too many awesome Mark-given pieces. I also like a lot of medieval art, particularly war art in general. I went through a lot of it when I was building maps, or alternatively, when I was looking for inspiration. And you can see how much John Blanche, for many of his pieces, is inspired by a lot of the medieval and Renaissance pieces, particularly of larger battles and how they manifest. They, to me, are a core inspiration too. But yeah, hopefully that helps a little bit there. Let's dive down. And Dynaman asks, hi Dynaman. I'm making a D&D mini-campaign in which the players are escorting a mysterious box. At one point, they have a choice going over these mountains, normal pass or shortcut. If they pick shortcut, surprise, Yetis! However, do you have any ideas for what to do on the long route? So the classic split here and gamer expectation is that the short route will be dangerous and problematic. The long route should be the safe one. I am a great believer in such narrative, let's call them guardrails, perhaps, or expectations for being a nonsense. If you always go with the standard stereotype, your games become tired, boring, and predictable. If you are doing the long route, I would probably make it worse. Give them an unexpected twist. This is something that I think that a lot of adventure writers kind of miss. They always go for the tried and tested tropes because they know they're going to be successful. But when you're running a game, there is no other route. The only route that matters is the route they take. And the route they take should always be interesting, detail-filled, and plot-relevant in some fashion or another. Alternatively, you can just ignore the plot and just have a nice sandbox and go wherever you want. That's equally a cool idea. But for me, I would be interested in reinforcing whatever your story is and making it just as dangerous, but in a different way. I'm not saying punish your players for taking the boring route, but at the same point, I'm saying there is no reason that the long route should be easier. In fact, it could be harder. Veritas M, I might have to dip. Oh no, but I'd love suggestions on how best to write a villainous long shank. I'm going the greedy route, Ty, but I'd love your opinion. So presuming that we're going with the Talite long shanks from Talopine, there's lots of different terms, lots of different things that use the term long shank. I'm going to presume that. I would look to, if we're going for a villainous longshank, and presumably again for the Talite version of it, the longshanks from Talopine, I would be looking at what is it core to be a Talite, and then what can we do to say this guy, this girl, whatever it might be, is different. Why is this effective Templar of Tal completely different to the others, and what is this one doing that is unacceptable to the standard cult, allows them to best utilize the position they have for their own benefit rather than the benefit of their order or the benefit of the people they're supposed to be serving. Greedy is a classic one. There are a whole host of other classic reasons as well. Talites are generally expected to be protecting the land, so you could have them flip on that, instead saying that certain lands are protected when they're not, allowing them to go over to greedy others or something equivalent, not helping the local populace in the way they should be, being bribed for one reason or another. There's lots of things you can do with villainous characters. But broadly speaking, I would take a look at what the stereotypes are for that group in your setting, look at those stereotypes and ask the question, how can I gain benefit from this as a character? And then start forming your villain around the benefits they're going to try and claim out of the longshank position that you've built for your game. I say that you've built because a lot of people use the Talite cult in really different ways, so it's pretty difficult to pin down how it might be expressing in your game. Exaggerated Swagger, do elves know or care about Grail Knights? I mean, some do, particularly over with the Wood Elves. The Grail Knights can be kicking around all over the place. Do they care? Yeah, because they're particularly powerful and dangerous enemy that may be making their way into their realm, but equally, there's something that many of them will be amused by, hate, not like. Elves are individuals, and elves, as are often forgotten, are not this great monolith that are all going to act in the same way. Loosely speaking, elves as a group do know. Care is an interesting term. It depends how you're deploying it, but it depends on their individual circumstances. If they are, for example, in a leadership role, then Grail Knights could be a very strong potential issue that they have to constantly deal with and potentially even join wild hunts to try and keep down. For others, the Grail Knights could be seen as great protectors over on that border from against Beastmen and similar. So channel the Beastmen in their direction, let the Grail Knights deal with it. There's been lots of different ways they're dealt with, but loosely speaking, Wood Elves in particular do know. High Elves, I mean, it's so far removed from their standard existence. Unless they are traveling elves who are stopping off in Bretonnia, one of the great elven enclaves in Bretonnia, then the chances of them caring about Grail Knights is next to almost certainly zero. The Singemeister, what are your thoughts on the 2011 Necron? I am getting a strong sense of deja vu because I've already covered this question earlier on in the stream. So, Singemeister, if you didn't know already, this question was asked right at the beginning of the stream where, let's see if I can find it. Who was it that asked it? Oh, it was near the beginning anyway. So this question has already been asked, and my thoughts, here we go, 2011, Magroth. The 2011 one. So I've already covered it earlier on the stream. If you missed it, just go back and rewatch that later. Apologies for having already answered that one. Moving down to Charles C.K. Is there any ATM or GM blogs? I love them. Yes, so do I. So they hit a whole host of barricades from both getting ill, then not getting ill, and getting too thick, and not getting too thick, and bouncing about. And every time I came back, my first responsibilities are always work and getting on top of all the work, for example, for the rookery and making sure that everything's lined up. And then I move on to something that might take a little bit more time elsewhere. I have written one, it's finished. I've got another one already half written too. The one that I haven't posted yet, it's not posted because there's two things I want to do for it first, but more of those are coming soon. If you know what the GM blogs are, LAWhammer's got a bunch of blogs that's gone along with it, discussing some of the choices that I made and why during the course of the campaign. And we are, only about a quarter of the way through the number of blogs I'm meant to have, somewhere around about 17 out of the 60 that should be there. So we're on episode 68 just now, so out of the 68 that should be there. So I have a bunch to catch up with, but they will be coming. Aleph, how many bodies do generate shyest perceptible for an average magister? Do vultures have noticeably higher amounts of them? What does it take to generate meaningful winds of magic for environmental purposes? Okay, so it takes a lot is the answer. The winds of magic all gather in people to different amounts because the winds of magic are not just about a single thing. There are a whole host of concepts all wrapped up in one. People who are particularly solemn, for example, or who are grieving will be gathering shyish to them, that dusty, almost sand-like wind gathering about them. The winds of magic come for lots of different reasons. So do vultures who are feeding upon the dead gather it to a certain amount? Yes, sure. But the big question here is it perceptible? If you don't channel the purple wind, then for most, no. Particularly because shyish is a very difficult wind to see if it's not a wind that you yourself are comfortable with or associated to. So the answer is, for the vast majority, no, none, very little. There's next to nothing there. They might catch the faintest amount of it. It's a little bit like, let's see if I can get a good analogy here. Yeah, okay. It's a little bit like a really crap torch. Now, if you get a really crap torch, we're not talking one with a very high wattage or a power in the bulb, but a really poor one. And during the day, if you lift up that torch, it doesn't provide really any additional light because the ambient light is already brighter. And indeed, just a few steps away from it, and you wouldn't even know that that torch was on. That is what the vast majority of the winds of magic are like to the vast majority of magisters. If you look for it and look directly at it, you go, oh yeah, that's lit. but I wouldn't have noticed it otherwise. But if you use the wind, or in this case, the light that's coming from this torch, now imagine it with all the lights switched off. It's now nighttime, it's dark. If somebody lifts up that pale, crappy torch, everybody can see it. And that is, for example, an amethyst user looking at that small source of amethyst magic coming away. So an amethyst user is going to spot most of these minor details better than all the rest. To everyone else, it's just another mix of the winds of magic that's really difficult to pinpoint or perceive. So what does it take to generate a meaningful winds of magic for environmental purposes? The answer is there. A lot. Generally speaking, you won't get, say, amethyst outside, amethyst wind, the purple wind outside of, say, a graveyard or a great battlefield where slaughter has taken place by an enormous amount. It requires a lot of death or a lot of a singular emotion for a lot of the amethyst wind to gather. Temples of Moor are notorious for this because there's lots of solemn people who are grieving and death passing through. So temples of Moor tend to have quite the gathering of both Shyish, which is the purple wind, and Heish, which is the white wind, which comes along with religiosity and purity, and thus temples often have great deals of Heish around it. But broadly speaking, it requires a lot. It's not something that simply happens to be a meaningful amount, but all it takes is the smallest change for a small dribble to come through. Hopefully that helps a bit. I've published a couple of things over the course of time concerning all the things that all the winds are attracted to. And we've discussed the winds of magic over in Loreberries in a couple of places, so I suggest having a quick look over there. Baron von Bastard, good evening, Andy. Good evening. Where do Skink Priests stand against the races in magical strength in a ranking sense? So this is one of those questions that, as far as the background is concerned, they're all equal broadly. And by that, I mean that each of the various species of the Warhammer world are capable of producing level 1 to level 4 wizards. And I'm using level 1 to level 4 because that's the term that Warhammer Fantasy has, even though they often disguise it in a variety of different terms, used for most of its editions. Although if we go back pre-4th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle, we're dealing with level 5 to level 25. So that's 5 levels. It'd go level 5, level 10, level 20, level 20, up to level 25. I missed that level 15 there. It'd be 5 different levels. So Teclis, for example, was a level 4 wizard, and he had himself his special artifact that turned him into a level 5. Nagash was the same, a level 4 wizard who had something that took him up to level 5. Skink Priests can go from level 1 up to level 4, so they can, broadly speaking, do the same as everybody else. And the answer is, broadly, that has always and long been the case. All species are broadly equally capable, but some of them tend to gravitate to certain levels. Most vampires sit around level 2, for example. They're much weaker in terms of the magic potential than many because they're entirely material creatures. But some vampires, like Manfred von Karstein, completely excels and blows it out the water in terms of his overall capability. Skinks sit right in the middle of there. You'd always have the slant sitting at the top because they're always the most powerful of them, but some Skink Priests can get all the way up to and be very similar in ranking to them. They are broadly equally capable, particularly because they have access to a whole host of types of magic and spells that over in, say, for example, the old world, it would be seen as new, for all they are working from the core concepts that are the winds of magic and how they all manifest. And there's only so many words that create so many effects. They're ultimately using the same spells. Not sure how useful that was. Good luck, I suppose. Still loading. What are ways demons use worshippers to corrupt? Holy crap, still loading. I could go on for hours on this topic alone. What time are we at? We're coming up to 1:30. Okay, so since we're at 1:30, and just before I do your answer there, still loading, at the end of the stream, I'm going to be doing a quick, or at least I hope I'm going to be doing a quick push over towards, in fact, I might even ask Hawk, since he's out there, to do a raid over to Rookery Publications at the end. To Rookery Publications, you might go, why? What are they doing today? We're doing a super fun stream. Tom Toner, who is a marvelous speculative fiction author, is running let's just call it a crazy world building workshop. He's going to, with all of the people who are watching the stream, so if you go over and watch it and throw ideas at him, he's going to do world building live with everybody who's in the stream. No matter how crazy your ideas are, throw them at Tom and let's see how that lands. That starts at 7 o'clock. So by 7 o'clock this evening, UK time, which is about half an hour from me, I'm going to be passing over there, doing a raid over on one side. And then hopefully YouTube should automatically, when I stop the video, kick you over there. I do recommend going over and watching, though, because it's going to be a super, super fun stream. Anyway, on this one, what are ways demons use whispers to corrupt? You're as well asking a different question still loading, which is, what do people want? What do they not admit that they want? And the second you answer that question, for each individual character, we then can say, what will the demons say to match those needs? Now, some are tempters. So they will find out what they want and they will offer what individuals are looking for through their own lens. Alternatively, others are just blindly saying, maybe you'll be tempted by this, maybe you'll be tempted by that, because there are classic things that get people going. Greed is a core one. People want more stuff. They want better lives. And that's the starting point for many a corruption. Someone sees something that they want, they can't get it, and someone says, I can help you get that. And suddenly, the seeds of corruption have been sown, and they may blossom into something particularly terrible. But I would instead say of this question, I would be looking at each one of my characters, my PCs or my NPCs, and asking what is it they want. And this is a mistake that many GMs make. So why is it a mistake? I'll tell you. Most GMs try to figure it out, and they shouldn't. They should go to the player and say, hey, I've got a demon, and it's going to try and corrupt you. So how's it going to work? Because your character, I don't know what's really going to work. You understand your character better than anyone else. What do you think would corrupt them? What do you think is really going to work here? How can we build a cool story that makes sense so that we can make a meaningful offer from a demon? We can do something that really works for the character and leaves you playing the character in a fun and difficult place where the character is really considering this. It's going to have to be something that you think fits. Work with your PCs to build good stories. Don't just simply impose the stories upon them and hope that they work. So my answer to this one is not necessarily what you'd expect. It is go ask players on a roleplay perspective, or if you're doing it for a writing exercise or something similar, think about those characters and what their core base wants and needs are. It may not be what they think they want, but it's very much what the character beneath their skin actually wants, the stuff they might not admit to. And then once you've got that, you've answered this question already. What are they going to do? They can then whisper in their own ways through cultists, through dreams, through a whole host of other ways as well. Hopefully that helps a bit. Dynaman comes in. One place I'm surprised doesn't have much lore, at least on the surface, is Sartosa. Seems like a prime location for beginning of adventures or where a strange assortment of people's like adventuring party can meet. Yeah, Sartosa has been touched upon in a host of places. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2's companion, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Companion, touches upon Sartosa. That was written by Andrew Kenrick, and he wrote something in the region of about 7-8 pages worth of loose material for Sartosa and what it might appear like. Sartosa also gets some extra material inside Dogs of War. The Dogs of War army list for Warhammer 5th edition gives you a pretty good breakdown of what the area is like. But again, it's only a few paragraphs. A variety of white dwarf articles have often referenced Sartosa as well, whether it's for pirate reasons or whatever. So it's often used, but it's very rarely used with any great depth. So you're right. It's not had a great deal of lore. I do think it's somewhere that, in agreement with you, could do with a bit more. Veritas M, thank you very much. I finished the Maneater stream. Yeah, nice. And I rambled to one of my not Warhammer fan friends about it. So we smooshed out original characters together. And now my ogre has a kind of daughter who will eat him when he dies. Fun! Hey! Love it. That puts a smile on my face, Veritas. It puts a smile on my face. Vespes, how do you feel about a certain bastard son of one of the elector counts? Did any of your previous Any Within campaigns explore his character and reveal association with him as a central feel? Right, so I'm going to start, Vespes, by saying I can't be certain which one you're referring to. There's more than one bastard son, whether it is, for example, Heinrich Todbringer, a classic bastard son from the north, that in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1st edition, spoiler alert, if you're playing the 1st edition Enemy Within, be careful, just blank out the next 5 seconds. Ready? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. He's Sigmar Reborn. And that is a thing. Where other editions have taken quite a different line because Sigmar Reborn is clearly someone else. So Did any of your previous Enemy Within campaigns explore this character? Oh, hell yes. If we're dealing with him, he was a central character. Indeed, one of my PCs married him in one of my previous versions of the campaigns, and he was definitely a character. In fact, you can find a reference to that over in the Tome of Salvation from 2007 approximately. If you go into the Cult of Ulrich section, you'll find that there's a great schism in the Cult of Ulrich because a priestess in the Cult of Ulrich has married into the Todbringers, and that causes problems. That's a reference to one of my wife's characters. That's Lindsay, who's also a writer for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, an editor for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and a player of LAWhammer. So I'm assuming you're saying him. If not, drop it down in the comments, and if I spot it, I will tell you. Necromancer Kobold. Hi, Necromancer. Thank you very much. What tips would you have for role-playing Frenzied Zealots? It's always a tough one. Due to plot stuff, my Eshin Skaven has been replaced with a martial-focused Pestilence Priest. My first tip for playing any sort of Zealot ever is to discuss it with your group, because Zealots can often be hardline, non-negotiable entities, and that can make for a shit roleplay experience. When, for example, something comes, it's one of the reasons Slayers cause problems, because they're effectively religious Zealots. They have got themselves a belief system, which means that they might not work well with the rest of the party, or the party's goals, or indeed even the adventure's goals. You make what you feel is a really cool character. You're like, oh, this is going to be fun. Then the story comes along, the party has goals, and suddenly you go, yeah, but my character's not interested in any of this bullshit. Yeah, no. And they start being a religious zealot, and it can often be disruptive in a way that makes the game significantly less fun for other people to engage with, and potentially the games master as well, who has a whole host of cool stuff they've thrown in your way, only to have you say, yeah, I'm not doing any of that because my character thinks that's bad. That's often, in turn, bad, wrong fun. But you can make it good, right fun by simply discussing with the group how to best work it through and say, these are my core beliefs. This is what I believe in. Do you think this is going to work? Now, some games, it's always going to work because the party doesn't care. We're just here to have a bit of fun, and religious zealots are cool. Away we go, woo! But for other parties, it will be a massive disruptor. So it's always worth discussing it out with your group. So my actual tips is talk with your group for the best outcomes, because every group plays differently. What works at my table might not work at your table, and what works at everyone else's table equally might not work at yours. The only people who can say for certain what's going to work well with your group is you and your group. So rather than try to create it for yourself in your own little hobbit hole in the corner, just building something you think is cool, bring it out to the rest of the group and say, this is what I'm thinking of. What do you think? Let's build something really cool together. And it's far more likely then when your crazy religious stuff causes a problem, everybody goes, oh, he's doing that thing we discussed, rather than, oh, holy shit, how do we get around this? He's causing problems again. Because you don't generally, when you're at the table, want to be getting antagonism out of character. In character antagonism is brilliant. Out of character antagonism, much less so. Oh, heck, thanks very much, Giga Wens. Hi, Andy. Hi in return. You have mentioned that the original plan was to have multiple possible endings for the enemy within detailed in the published books, but that didn't end up happening. Correct. Could you give a rundown of some of the options you were planning for? So I have a couple of issues here. Generally speaking, I don't like discussing in any great depth material that wasn't published, because ultimately that makes it sound like what is published is somehow lesser, and what wasn't published was this secret thing that was super cool that would have been better. Pardon me, quick drink. Much better. Right, so I have a trepidation here because there is no right way to write a book. And the original plan was an original plan, and it was changed through development after I left, and that's cool. I will speak in thus general terms rather than specifics. The idea was to present various end states for the Empire, that's one part, and how the core plot points of the Enemy Within campaign could lead to those various end states. None of them were really going to be ending 1, ending 2, ending 3. Instead, it was going to be more of a broader discussion of how the different end states for the Empire could occur because of the events of the Enemy Within campaign. And there's obvious standout points for that. Who ends up being the ruler of the Empire, for example? And the answer was going to be a variety of different options. according to the different way things that could have played out. There is also going to be a variety of different potential ways it could end, with conflict, with politics, with negotiations, with giant demons doing giant demonic stuff throughout almost all of them. The idea wasn't to provide the end. The idea was to inspire the GM to create the perfect end for the type of campaign that they had just spent a year, 2 years, or maybe 3 years playing through. And you'll find that no story can ever be understood until you play it. And when you play it, the parts that really work for your players might lead that table to go in a different direction to what the actual written word is. And the written word basically says, and come the end, they will all do this. And that stands contrary to how, for example, you have been portraying the game for the last 2 years. Then the written version that you find inside a book is useless to you and you have to make up your own. So the job was, loosely speaking, to provide a toolbox so that no matter what your campaign had done, you had yourself a clear, obvious set of tools to provide an end. It wouldn't have, for example, have dealt with, say, the Nine Eyes or any of that nonsense. It was going to be very much all about what happened during the Enemy Within campaign and its various factions. I'm not sure how useful that was in an answer. Daniel L., bit of a call back. Okay, I need to also take a quick check as to how far down we are in our comments, because I'm looking at the time and there's quite a few come in on Super Chat. So I'm going to speed up a bit, given that we're at 22, and I would like to finish at the hour so that you can all check out Tom Toner's stream where he's doing the craziest world building stream you will ever see. It's going to be amazing over in the Rookery. So I'm going to run through these a touch faster. Bit of a callback for Empire City's legal charters. Are there any provinces that don't use temples and have some other measure by which they define city, town, etc., or unexpected deities? So unexpected deities, oh hell yes, loads of them all over the place. Every corner of the Empire has temples to deities that you won't expect. So that part, yes. As to legal charters for the Empire, are there any provinces that don't use temples? Probably, but it's not written into the background anywhere. So the answer is that the current background doesn't actually answer this question. It's only answered in individual games. Now, for LAWhammer, this is 100% defined. And indeed, over on World Anvil, which is an online world building site, which I do recommend, it's pretty fucking cool. World Anvil, we've shown, for example, how the Reichel defines a village, a hamlet, a town, a city, and it is indeed defined by temples of Sigmar. Does it have a temple of Sigmar? No, then it's just a hamlet, because it doesn't matter. It's a tiny little village without a temple. Has it got a single temple of Sigmar? Yeah, it's a village. Has it got more than one of them, up to three or more? It's now a town. Has it got a high temple of Sigmar? A really important place. It's now a city. And that is how it's legally defined in the Reichland. But that's for LAWhammer. That's not for Warhammer as a whole. Warhammer as a whole has never really detailed that. Now, if I was to go into detail provincial backgrounds inside a book somewhere, I'd use the LAWhammer version probably as a good solid basis, because it makes sense. I've got a different version for Hochland, I've got a different version for the Ostermark, and I chose purposely 2 provinces that aren't provinces during the Enemy Within campaign. Yeah, I could do that, but the answer is officially there isn't an answer for this one, and you have to make up your own. Right, where were we? I think we are here. The Sinchmeister. Where would you put an Edmund Blackader in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay? I would be extremely careful with this, in the same way I'd be extremely careful with any Monty Python reference or similar, because those sorts of reference for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, or indeed something like, say, Terry Pratchett's various Discworld options, are just too obvious a reference. I prefer to hide them a little bit more clearly, but Edmund Blackader in particular is a Reichlander in almost all ways in how he works. He's just a perfect one in terms of how it sits down. But it's up to you and how you want to use that kind of material. Nekron Rewrite, how would you go about statting PCs for chaos-leaning races like species, but my preference, Chorfs, Fimmer, and maybe Skinwolves? What unique careers would they have? Okay, so Chaos Dwarves, they'd be started in a very similar way to Dwarfs, with a different basis for the potential of mutation, and also a couple of their physiological differences that you'd want to include. And then you just build out the career trees to support their culture, which would be a more slave-based culture, and what is required to maintain their almost hyper-theocratic tyrant-based hellhole. So you just go through all the things that they need to do and then split them up. Fimmer, by comparison, are out in the wilds doing a very different set of jobs. So you need to have a bunch of creators that support their far more rural lifestyles. Skinwolves, again, completely different. Basically, you keep basic stats with hopefully not more than 1 or 2 talents that explains all of their unique processes, and then you leave the rest of it to individual GM description. As to unique careers, I mean, it's a big question because you sit down with each and you have a good think normally. So just dropping off the top of my head, I'm almost certain to go, oh, I don't know. Fimmer will have a hunter, obviously, and they'll have their nobles, their Fim class, and they'll have their Mirgats. So we need our witches. How are we going to best represent that? You just go through the Fimmer society as it stands and then make sure that all of it is represented as you build through. But if I sat down and did it properly, I'd almost certainly come up with a few unique things. The Orange Pepper. Hi, Orange Pepper. Hi, Andy. Hi in return. I'm new to GMing. Excellent. I'm running 4E starter adventure. Oh, good times. With plans to go into the enemy within, is there anything I should try to keep in mind since I have an Eonar, Kislevite, and Sartosan PC? Nice mix. I know I said I'd answer this quicker, but I'd like to give something that's actually useful here. I would decide what your enemy within campaign is going to be. And by that, I mean, I'd read it. And I know that's a lot of reading. And I know that's recommending you go out and go buy a lot of books, but I'd read it and I'd think about the story that it tells and whether you like it. And if you don't, change it to what you do. And if you do, reinforce it. Think about the end and the end of the campaign you're going to do, and think about how you can introduce what's going to happen at the end as early as possible. This is something that we've done a lot in LAWhammer. Where we have ensured that all the things that are going to be coming at the end have already been discussed long before we get to the end. We don't want there to be any big surprises as to how the campaign unfolds, but we do want to have a campaign full of surprises. Beyond that, I'd say don't worry too much about it. Have fun. The aim is to go week by week, and if your player's going in a different direction than what the story suggests, have fun with that also. Let it go. The aim is for everyone to have a laugh and want to come back every single week. So rather than trying to force your players into follow a fixed plot, be aware that being a part of a GM is to tell really cool stories and for the players to also tell those stories with the things that they like. If I was going to say one thing as a major discussion point, it would be, as always, talk to your players about what they're enjoying and try to reinforce that. I'm not sure how useful that is. Theo Bonaro, hello in turn. What's the difference between the Fire Mountain of the Ogres and Morsley? I mean, it's huge. By all accounts, the moon would have more worshippers. No. Theo, I'm not even sure how to explain this one beyond saying they're different. They're completely different. Like massively different. I mean, the Fire Mountain is a very local area that the ogres are particularly interested in. The moon is worshipped across the old world by a variety of different societies, cultures, and species. So you're right. It does have many, many, many more worshippers. If we just look to the greenskins and the great bad moon that sits up there. It has a bunch of worshippers in some respect there. In a similar fashion, the Skaven and the great horned rat that the Morsley moon represents. Many of them worship the moon as a particularly holy symbol. So yeah, there's loads of it, but the difference is that they're completely different things in different parts of the world, and they are revered in very different ways by different populaces. I'm not sure if that's useful at all, though. Baron von Bastard, for Total War, which character unit do you think had the biggest improvement over the original model or art? I am not enough of an expert of Total War to give a true answer on that. This is a question that's probably better for Sotek. If I look back at my experiences with it, I started with Total War 1, barely touched 2, played it a little bit, played 3 a fair chunk. I have opinions on a lot of Total Wars units I wish were different. A lot of the stories that I wish were a little bit different. I'm so instead going to take this in a slightly different way, and I'm going to say that the original Kislev, which I wrote, is quite different to Total War's one, and I think Total War have done a damn fine job at that. So I think they've had a great improvement there, although I do wish a little bit more time was spent on the hags and the Ungals in general. So there we go. That's an answer. Hey, Andy, says Agar89. With the dwarves originally having come from an age of great tech, why would dwarves that innovate tech not be seen as returning to the old ages? Because that's not what they do. Innovation is very different to discovery of what came before. If you're innovating, you're making something new and you think you're better than your ancestors. If you're taking something your ancestors did and trying to make the best equivalent version of it, then you are now properly returning to the old ages. There's a big difference between innovation into something new and returning to something old and hopefully understanding it. So I think that's enough of an explanation. If you don't, drop in another comment and I'll hopefully catch it. Gneevil, in the 4E stuff you wrote, it seems like the idea is to do the starter set, then do the enemy within. Was this the intention? And if so, how would you advise dealing with the PCs being so much stronger than normal? It's not an issue. The biggest problem is that all of the enemy within books didn't stat their bad guys at all well. Meaning that it's not just a problem for people who've been through the starter set into the enemy within, it's a problem for all characters in enemy within that the PCs are stronger than the NPCs would suggest. So this is a universal problem, Knievel. So in many respects, it won't matter. Was the starter set the original intention to move into the enemy within? Yes. Was the story of the starter set meant to be the prelude to the enemy within? Yes. Was the stories around Uber's Right meant to go directly into the enemy within and be resolved at the end of the enemy within? Absolutely yes. Is that what happened? No, because intentions change and writers go in different directions. But I will say, if you want to see a version of that, we do cover this deeply inside LAWhammer. Sorcerer Friend, should Games Workshop have learned more and leaned more into the Hellberg novels version of Bretonian Knights, i.e. brutal armored giants that are just flat out better than baseline humans, rather than the virtuous but more regular version of them in the old world? Yeah, no, it depends on the day. You'll find most of the virtuous lines come from Bretonian books, and most of the not so virtuous come from other people's version of them. For example, the Hellberg novel. Although you'll find that in many respects, the reality of the super noble, virtuous version is not necessarily the case when you move over to the various novels. I prefer a grimmer version of Warhammer in general, but I also don't mind the virtuous aspect too. I think they're all true, and they should all be able to exist within the same setting. When they only take single versions of things, I'm often left sitting at the edge going, really? But take a look at the Cathay, for example. The version of Cathay that's presented inside the Old World Army list is beyond idealized and contradicts itself in several positions because of that. But those contradictions are useful because it allows us to say, actually, the world is much more complicated than you first think. And I think that's probably the case for Bretonia. But thanks very much for that one. Theo, could a creature from either die twice inside the mortal realm? From the ether, die twice in the mortal realm. Could multiple versions of a single entity coexist at the same time? So could, say, a demon or a spirit die in the mortal realm, then come back again? Yes, happens a lot. Could multiple versions of a single entity coexist at the same time? The answer to that is actually yes. It's a complicated affair, but time in the aether is weird, and this can occur. And there are some weak examples of it across Warhammer backgrounds of various etheric entities that are possibly appearing to be in more than one place at once. So strictly yes, although it's very rare. Skylar Martin, while running Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, I rewrote the history of the gnomes because I found it too depressing. Is there any legacy content that supports their 4E portrayal? Pretty much nothing. You can do whatever you want with it and you'll be fine. If you want to see a different version of the gnomes, literally the last episode of LAWhammer gives a very different tale. It'll be going live on the Monday. It isn't depressing at all. It's actually come the end of it. I was very surprised. Skylar Martin. No, that's not a question I just had. Intense ultimatum. Hi, Andy. If there was an old one containment array for a star, which wins would be produced? Azir? Yes. Actually, yes. What about black hole stacks? Oh, cripes. Okay, so say they had a little star, what winds would come out of that? I would suggest all of them in a variety of different terms, because the amount of heavy elements that would be involved inside there would be pumping out Shimon beyond anyone's expectation. There'd be so much of that wrapped up in there. Heish is not really something that'd be there that much because it's not, but there's a purity of reality that's involved with it. There'd be Heish. In fact, loosely, all of wins, it's in a state of constant entropy moving from one thing to the next. It is effectively dying at all times. It heads towards its death. All of the winds are going to be in there, but obviously the heat is intense. The fact that it's no longer in the heavens suggests there might actually be less Azir than you might first think, though. So hopefully that helps a bit. Tyrant 25, given that the Empire is 8% forest and the forest, not actually, if you look at the map, it's closer to 60, but sure. And the forests are full of beastmen. How nuts is it that the beastmen aren't considered the Empire's #1 threat? It's pretty nuts in various parts of the Empire because they kind of should be. Because they are horrendously, potentially awful. And they're moving around in relatively large war herds. They're much more secretive than the battle game might suggest, often doing their own things and raiding smaller villages and towns rather than going up against anything of any major influence. But I think, Tyrant, you have a point, and how you rationalize that for your own games is up to you. Moving down to Ricky Chapman. We love when gods with similar domains interact. Cain and Corn followers going at each other like rabid dogs, for instance. I agree. Any gods you enjoy seeing interact? Like loads of them. In fact, I just like seeing different gods with very different or similar remits going toe to toe because it makes for interesting story. Any conflict always interests me as a creator. Christ, look at the time. How am I doing for comments? Oh, I'm almost catching up. So for me, almost any, if I was to highlight one, there's a lack of Myrmidian conflict directly related to any core stories. I would just like to see one. There's an obvious core Ulrich one. It was hinted at the Tome of Salvation, where we even had one character, Ionis, was it Ionis? Yeah, I think it was Giannis and Escu, who is mentioned as the character behind that. So I wouldn't mind seeing that one developed a bit further. Daniel, how important is the Barbers Guild in the Dawi Society? Also, you missed me in a super chat. Did I, Daniel? Did I miss a super chat from you? I'm scrolling back right now because that is a crime. So Daniel. I'm not seeing it. Oh, no. So it looks like if I've missed, oh no, is it this one? It is. Here we go. I found you. If Gargrim knew that his father, oh, how did I miss this one? Would take the Slayer oath after his death, would that have changed anything? Yes, absolutely. Gargrim would have confronted his father about him and then said, you can't do this. They'd have had a big barney about it. And then he would have probably, the same story would have happened. And the outcome would almost certainly have been the same regardless. So the outcome would be the same, but I think the story would be completely different if he knew. And very possibly that story would mean that it just ends differently. But moving back to your other one, how important is Barbers Guild? Enormously so, and I really wish more was done about it. Barber Surgeon Guilds inside the Empire would give them much more detail than the obviously important Barbers Guild that you would find inside the Karazankor. Moving down to Sorcerer Friend. Do ogre big names have actual metaphysical impact? Not with any of the rules, but I absolutely think that they possibly could do so. That would require some new rules to be written, but I think that's an open space inside the fantasy roleplay game that you could fill. Henrik Veerbeek, have an idea to have a Slanesh demon tempt my players to exchange secrets with them during any within. Nice. Would such an act damn their souls? I mean, it's not going to help. I would say that you'd be looking at them gaining corruption points, and those corruption points would eventually lead to mutations of some kind. That seems to be the obvious route to take. A few extra corruption, and if you don't want them to realize that, do it secretly, although they might call you a dick and never want to play with you again. If you did that, generally speaking, the only reason to ever do it secretly is if you've already made a contract with your players before play saying, if you do naughty things, I'm going to put corruption points down, but not tell you, so that when the corruption actually happens, it comes as a surprise for everyone, including your characters. Is that okay? And if they say no, then don't do it. Veritas M, do you feel about the ogre song from the trailer? Ogres were previously written as to not having higher interest in any form of art or song. So when the song came out, my first thought was, oh, well, they've rewritten that. I actually quite like it, though, because I think it's a lot of fun. Sarmelian Bloodweaver, more teeth money. Thank you very much. But it comes with a cursed knowledge of spider squig, a colossal squig with eggs laid in it by spiders. Oh, no. So it vomits spiders when it roars and explodes, breeds swarms of spiders. Dude, thanks for that. But thanks in turn. Hey, Walker. I hope I haven't missed any because I'm screaming through them now because we're almost at time. I'm an incorrigible token stan. Sounds good. And I also want to contribute to the teeth. Thank you very much. So what is your favorite thing about Tolkien, his setting generally, and how it relates to Warhammer specifically? If it hadn't been for Tolkien, much of we understand of Warhammer just wouldn't exist, particularly their elves. Now, they're, in truth, the character of the elves are more taken from Michael Moorcock, but the stature and the general... actually, no, that came from Moorcock too. Halflings wouldn't exist without them. Popularity, that's what I'm going to go with. Tolkien broke a market that otherwise wouldn't have been broken, and he is popular. And I love that because it means that me, who loves fantasy in general, has a far broader audience that we can interact with. And the movies in particular nailed it. Morning Crescent, how important to you is Warhammer roots in satire? Very. Without the satire, it becomes po-faced and somewhat broken. And without the satire, many of the crushing institutions that are present in Warhammer, especially in 40k, become lionized rather than demonized. And that's not something that I personally prefer. I think it is a core component of what Warhammer is to its very core. And if people miss it, you end up with just not the best setting, if I'm honest. Satire, though, for me, is just something that I very much enjoy. Holy moly. So that's us reaching up towards the hour. Before I answer another couple of little last bits, I've got a couple of things to say. Number one, if you haven't bought Dark Deeds, go buy it. I always say that, so just make sure that I've definitely said it. Number two, we're going to be passing over to the Rookery very soon. They're doing a world building stream live, so you can contribute to that stream as they're doing it. And they've got author Tom Toner, who has done this live world building at conventions several times before. But he's never done it live online. So this is going to be something really quite different. So if you pile over and watch that afterwards, hopefully just as we hit the end, we'll get that. Apparently I missed 2 super chats. Okay. Crap. Which ones did I miss? Because I moved really quickly. Can you highlight them so I can get them just before we hit the end? And if I do miss them here, I'll do another stream next Saturday to make sure we catch them, because I would like to ensure that I didn't miss any. Can you just drop the comments right now in the chats and I will answer it, because I don't want to miss any, because that is just a crime. If you've said something over to me as a way of saying thanks, I want to say thanks in return by answering your question. I can't believe I missed 2. Did I really miss 2? I was going as cleanly as I could. No, they've not popped up. Okay, Ricky, apologies for that one, Ricky. Let's make sure that we catch them for next time, because I very much want to do so. Oh, here we go. We love when gods with similar domains. I did that one, Ricky. Don't worry. I did discuss that one earlier, and I answered it with Myrmidia and Ulrich. So that one was answered. Oh, I don't feel so bad. One of the ones that apparently I missed, I didn't. So if I missed another one, can you post that one too? So anything other than that? Yes, world building in a moment over in Rookery. We are this Sunday doing Marathi. Oh, Marathi's going to be great. So that's tomorrow. We're doing Marathi at 4 p.m. UK time. So make sure you come and join us at 4 UK time, because it's going to be a laugh. Right, beyond that, I'm going to say thanks very much to everyone. I'm going to try and do a raid over to Rookery Publications. I always do this wrong. So hopefully this works. If it doesn't, Hawk, can you do it? Because I have clearly screwed it up. In fact, I'm not seeing it actually raiding there, so maybe I screwed it up. Who knows? When I finish off on YouTube, it should automatically take you there. If it doesn't, just type in Rookery Publications into YouTube and you'll find their stream live right now. I believe it's just gone live. So if you can go over there, join Tom Toner and world build with him. The more crazy ideas he can get, the better. You are raiding on Twitch. Oh, excellent. I can't do it for you, unfortunately. Is that right, Hawk? Well, there you go. That is just a crime. That is not how it should be. But thank you very much, Hawk. So with that, I'm going to bid you all a good evening. And if I have missed any comments, as Ricky said, we'll bring them up for the next Ask Me Anything and make sure they're answered then. So until then, I will see you all later. Bye-bye.